Welcome to this first video in what's hopefully going to be a short series in how to set up and work with Palo Alto firewalls. In the first video here, we're going to set up our virtual environment. We're going to set up a computer to act as our host with some VMs that we're going to use later on and our virtual firewall. This video is actually partnered along with a presentation that I've done in British Columbia, where I live. So if you're watching this, there will be some slight differences between this video and the presentation that I give. This video will be a bit more linear and a bit more in-depth just because we don't have time restrictions. And I can also pause the video while the virtual environment does things like reboot or acquire licensing files and all of that stuff. So if you found the presentation to be a bit confusing because I jumped around, this will probably be for you. And also make sure you go check out on the website along with this. There'll be a link in the description. I've got a small workbook that goes along with this as well. It has all the commands and everything that I use, so you don't have to worry about trying to read it on the screen or anything like that. So we've got a couple of natural breaks in this presentation while computers reboot and licensing files propagate. So we're going to jump right in and set up this computer with Hyper-V. Before we do that, let's have a quick look at the network configuration on this computer. We've got a single Ethernet interface that's connected to our network. So I've got an IP address on this already. We've got network on our computer. Let's just double check. Yep, we can look at things. So we're going to compare this in a couple minutes after we enable the Hyper-V feature. So in Windows, there's not much to this. The reason we're doing Hyper-V on here is because I thought a lot of people would already have access to the licensing required to this. So if you have Windows Pro or Windows Enterprise, you can use Hyper-V and you can run a couple of VMs in it. And the only thing to watch out for when you do this is your PC will reboot. So I'll pause the video at a couple points in this just so we don't have to watch it. So now that our computer's rebooted, let's have a look at some of the changes that have been made to it. If we go back into the network control panel, we can see now that we have a new object. We have a virtual switch that Hyper-V has created for us. And the virtual switch is special, or at least the first one that Hyper-V creates. This virtual switch has NAT and DHCP enabled on it, and we can't modify it. So that's great, but we want to do those things with our firewall instead of doing them through Hyper-V. So we're going to go ahead and create a couple of new switches. We'll create one that's just connected to our network adapter for internet access. And we'll share that with our host operating system. We'll also create an internal network. This will be for our LAN clients. So it has no internet access. If you wanted, if you had a second network adapter, you could associate this with your second adapter. You could plug an external switch into it, and that would allow you to share your virtual firewall with physical clients if you wanted to do that. So let's have a look at the changes that have been made to our computer. Now we have two new virtual switches. We have our internet switch and our LAN switch. And we can see that Hyper-V has moved the network settings from our Ethernet card to the virtual switch interface. So just be aware of that. If you're troubleshooting, if you have something like a static IP address, or something's not working, check the IP configuration in that virtual switch and make sure it was all copied over correctly. All right, let's create our firewall. So I've already gone ahead and looked at the settings for this. We'll review those while the firewall is booting. So if you're wondering what I'm doing here, no, I'm not just accepting the default settings. I've read ahead. We're going to create a Gen 1 virtual machine with 4 gigs of memory. We're going to connect this to our internet connection. This is for the management card on our virtual firewall. We'll attach a virtual hard disk in a minute. And so where do you grab this virtual hard disk? It's on the support website for Palo Alto Networks. I've already downloaded it ahead of time. I'm going to make a copy of this because I want to save the original in case I want to make a new firewall. Okay, so we have a couple of settings that we need to change inside our newly created VM. Some of these are just the default settings that Hyper-V provides that are not exactly what we want. And some of them are just setting up the rest of the hardware that the firewall needs to function. So first off, this version of the firewall needs 2 CPUs. If we were using this in a more structured environment, say even as the firewall for your home network, we would go ahead and set up virtual machine reserves on this. That's pretty much a requirement for virtual firewalls, but because this is just a lab, we'll leave it alone for now. This host is also not oversubscribed on CPU cores, so I don't really have to worry about that. And let's browse for our new virtual disk. There it is. Now, here's our initial network adapter. The first network adapter that gets created on the firewall is for the management interface in the virtual firewall. Now, this model of firewall can have up to 7 interfaces. Just for completeness, we're going to create them all now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. In Hyper-V, I didn't see anything in the documentation about this step being required. In VMware, it pretty much is. Create all 7 NICs, save the settings to the VM, and go back in there. That way you don't risk having your virtual NICs reordered at some point and losing connectivity to your virtual firewall. The other requirement that we have in Hyper-V for these virtual NICs is we need to, well, first we need to connect them to an interface. So interface 1 will be our internet connection. We need to enable MAC address spoofing, and I'll explain what that is when we apply the settings here. We'll connect interface 2 to the LAN. The other thing I want to go ahead and disable in here, in this version of Hyper-V, automatic checkpoints are enabled by default. I don't actually think these virtual firewalls support checkpoints and live migration and all of that stuff, just because they are packet forwarding devices. So we're going to turn that off. The other reason I turn that off too is I don't really find checkpoints that useful for virtual firewalls because we can save and export configuration snapshots. So we don't really need them. I'm also just going to change some of these default actions. Under integration services, because this is a Linux VM, we don't support VSS or data exchange. So we can turn those off. So when you saw me, I'm going to power this up here because it takes a minute. When you saw me go into the network adapter settings and modify that MAC spoofing option, that option is a security feature in Hyper-V. So what MAC spoofing does is it tells Hyper-V that any packets coming out of that virtual interface should have the same source MAC address as is configured in the virtual machine. So in a firewall, potentially we could have other MAC addresses coming out of that interface, especially if we're using something like a bridge interface or a VLAN interface, a layer 2 interface. So we need to go ahead and turn those off, otherwise we're not going to get any packet forwarding and some really strange behavior in the firewall. While this is booting, let's also have a look and see what the virtual machine requirements are for the firewalls. This is something you can find a link in the documentation that goes along with this video. This is something you can find in the manual for the VM series firewall. And I'm using a VM50 because we're not going to be doing very much with it. And if we look at the system requirements for it, we can see they tell us how much memory and how many vCPUs this thing needs. One thing I would also like to point out in here while we're taking a little break while the firewall's loading is the change between versions. So I'm in 8.1 where we've got memory of 4.5 gigs and a disk size of 32 gigs. If we go to 9.0 and look at this same document, we can see here that we now have increased memory, and for some of the firewalls, I think the disk has stayed the same in here. I know from 7 to 8, it jumped from I think 40 to 60 gigs. This really doesn't matter in our lab because when we're done with the firewall, we're pretty much just going to turn it off and blow it away. If you're using this in an environment where you want to keep it online longer and potentially upgrade it from 8.1 to 9, say for example you want to test your config and see if it survives an upgrade, that will be something you want to keep in mind. Make sure that when you provision your virtual firewall, it meets the system requirements for the future version. So now that our firewall is up, I'm actually watching for a message here. The first thing it'll do is it'll show a log message on the screen that tells me exactly what, or tells me what my IP address is. So if I didn't want to go in and do the initial address configuration of the management interface in the CLI, I can just go into a web browser and do that. While it's still loading, let's get signed in to the portal because we're going to need to get the information we need for our licensing file. This is another important little tidbit that you'll want to know while you're setting these up. If you don't have internet access to the firewall, getting it licensed can be very difficult. Yes, they have an online activate or an offline activation feature for the firewall, but I find that's a bit of a misnomer because the first thing the firewall does is phone home to retrieve, do its license negotiation, even in offline mode. So you end up with a bit of a chicken and an egg scenario. Get the firewall licensed on a network where it has internet access before you do a config. Otherwise, you can't make any modifications to the network or basically anything outside the device tab. You can't commit. So you can't create network interfaces, zones, all that stuff that you might need for network connectivity. Let's have a look inside our virtual firewall. Yep, there we go. We're online. So it's already assigned an IP address to it in my network. Let's go ahead and change that, and then we'll go in and put a license file on it. Okay, there we go. I've put an IP address in there. I also went ahead and set the NTP server on this thing, just because it doesn't have a hardware clock in it, and we need accurate time for license activation. So it should be syncing over from the host OS, but just in case it isn't, we're covered. To test connectivity now, let's just ping the default gateway and make sure we have internet access. All right, that looks good to me. So now that we're out of this guy, we can go in and move over to the web interface. So pretty much the first thing we need to do before we can put a config in this thing is activate it. We need to put a license file on it. And doing that's relatively easy. You will need to have a VM series auth code in your Palo Alto portal. And you will also need to have a valid service contract for it. So I've already got all of those. There are also different ways to license this, but if you're, again, the group in British Columbia, this is how you will license your firewall. So we'll do it that way. And it's pretty simple. On the device tab, go to licenses, and we're going to activate feature using authorization code. First thing we're going to do is download an authorization file. If we have a look inside this thing, it just shows our, different IDs that the firewall uses. And then I'm going to take that, I'm going to go over into the support portal. And you can see here in my account, I have an auth code. I'm going to blur this out because this video is on the internet. I can just do register VM. I don't even have to copy and paste. I can just grab this authorization file that the firewall generated. The only part I don't like in here for the OS release, oh my God, you've got to scroll through all of this stuff here. That's fine. We can do that. We're not going to complain at all, are we? The one thing to watch out for on this is that the activation is not completely instantaneous. And also this screen where they ask you for all of this garbage, I am going to leave it blank because this is not a production firewall. Nobody cares. So I need to give it about 3 or 4 minutes between when I submit all the information to Palo Alto and I put the auth code in the firewall. Let's actually try it right now and see if it does anything with it. I go back in to activate using authorization code, put my auth code in there. Yeah, the firewall will restart. Yeah, so failed to fetch licensing. So I'm going to pause the video and give this a minute to digest, and we'll come back to it in about 2 or 3 minutes and see if it authorizes. All right, we've waited a few minutes. Let's try entering the auth code in. Okay, so that time it worked. And just to let you know, I ended up actually having to reboot this firewall. I waited, if you look at the timestamp down below, it's been almost an hour. It didn't work and it didn't work. I ended up just rebooting the firewall. So anyway, we'll wait for this to load and we'll put a default config in so we can see if our VM reaches the outside world. Okay, so our firewall has rebooted. Let's put a config in so we can give it a test. All right, so I'm not going to describe every part of this, and if I can, I might actually speed the video up just so you see what I'm doing very quickly. The point of this video is to show you how to get the virtual machine running, not to set up the firewall. So. Okay, that should be enough to get us up and running. So let's commit this and go on to our virtual workstation and see what we get. All right, so we've got a successful commit. And there we go. Alright, so our DNS, we're not traversing the router. Let's have a quick look at the logs. Yeah, so we're not hitting our security policy. I think I'll leave this in as it's not a bad troubleshooting step. Here we go, I've selected the wrong destination zone. So one thing I like about the virtual firewalls is the commit times are a lot faster than on some of the smaller ones like the PA220s. And you'll notice we've got this alert on our host hypervisor now. That's because we created a virtual network, a private network that has the virtual switch on our workstation. So we're a part of this network too. There we go. Now we have name resolution. And we can browse websites. So there we go. We've now got the basics going for a virtual lab that we can use to test our policies, to try things out and play with. The one other thing I'll show you just before we end is back on the Support tab. When we're done with this virtual firewall, say we'd like to reset it or pass it on to somebody else, we would go into the portal and we can go deactivate VM and just remove the license there. We don't really need to bother, at least not with our authorization codes if you're using this method for licensing. You don't really need to bother with anything else. You can generate a deactivation file from the firewall, but it's not required. You can just deactivate it right from in here. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Leave comments down below if you have any questions. And if you're from British Columbia, leave me a comment on Yammer. Thank you very much.